welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we are joined today by Carlos Simon and Marco Pave, who were collaborators on an amazing project, Requiem for the Enslaved, which has been nominated for a Grammy.
The days were void of light. The nights swallowed our pain whole like a reptilian predator. But that was on Earth, the devil's playground, where evil rendezvous with the innocent and the victim becomes the enemy. The enemy of the powers that be, regimes that gain their power by illicit means, lies.
It's an extraordinary story of 272 souls who went through the tragedy of American enslavement and come out on the other side, in a really kind of beautifully articulated way via this project.
When I found I had crossed that line, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such glory over everything. What does it mean for your soul if your body was never free? What happens to the soul of the slave if the shackles release? Slave in the flesh, the soul has yet to face an adequate test.
How are you two brothers doing today?
We're doing amazing. Well, I'm doing amazing. I'm sure Carlos is doing well too.
Yeah, I'm hanging in there. Thanks for having us.
So talk a little bit about the genesis of this project.
Yeah, well, I'll start here, but I joined the faculty at Georgetown University in 2019. And one of the things that I wanted to do is sort of learn about the history of the school, the culture. I was born in DC, and I stayed on the southeast DC, so it's a different side than it is in Georgetown. But we always heard about Georgetown, and it had a weight. It has a weight here in the DC culture. So when I joined the faculty, I was like, let's learn about the history, the culture, and just kind of embed myself into this. I did my due diligence, and of course, discovering the New York Times article and all the work that was being done around the GU 272. This is you just mentioned, where the university owned not many, not just 272 people, but more than that, over a span of time. And that was one of the largest sales that I discovered. And so that led me down the path of going to the archives. And as a Black man, I was just so, just like amazed and just intrigued, but also just shocked at this history. Well, not really shocked, but it was really something that I wanted to dive into as far as the arts are concerned. There was work already being done, throughout the university for reconciliation, which I was really happy about. But there was nothing really being done on the artistic side. And so that's when I decided to do that, write a piece. And Marco joined at the same time, the faculty as the artist in residence. And so we collaborated and started the project that way.
Never seen a sale, but I used to sell. Real nigga DNA all up in my cells. Never seen a sale, but I used to sell. Real nigga DNA all up in my cells. Had them pounds coming in.
Talk about how you came onto the project, Marco.
Like Carlos said, I got to Georgetown in 2019 as well. Really got there hitting the ground running with my events, and really wanted to meet, the faculty and staff that were in the department. And me and Carlos kind of mostly hit it off immediately. Mostly, you know how it is seeing another Black person in a white space. So it's like immediately you like, yeah, that's my friend. So it's like that's kind of how it was. But it was a true, true friendship and a true collaboration meant, I would say set up by the ancestors. Like we didn't know each other. We didn't know, what was going to be happening. But once we started collaborating and, then the pandemic happened. And so we really had to, create this project away from each other in a way that I'm usually used to in hip hop, like sending me beats and I write my style and send it back to you. So it was kind of like a lot of that for the parts that were specifically for me. He would ask like, what kind of rhythm do you want? What kind of energy are you looking for? And I would, describe a sound and, he was sending the different snippets and I would say, okay, yeah, I like this one. And I would write to that. And yeah, it kind of came together like that through the pandemic.
Lord have mercy on my soul. Set us free. This is not a world created by God. This is a country created by mobs. Kill, pillage, freedom, robbed. We were stolen. No time to sob.
Tell me, Marco, and for those who are familiar with your previous work, I mean, this is a bit of a change, right? I still have Black Tux on regular rotation. Yeah. And so, but, this is a very different style of music. Mm-hmm. The presentation is different. What was it like trying to write, to what is a very different style of presentation musically for you?
It was, so I had my first training ground. I went through, I would say my trial by fire by writing my opera in 2017. So I wrote the libretto for Welcome to Graceland 2030, which was basically taking my album and recreating the album as an opera. So yeah, I wrote all these characters and wrote all this dialogue and wrote all these conversations through the music. So that was kind of like my first instantiation in classical music. But even in that, I was like, my opera really had very sparse singing. It was like the opera conversation that I'm having is the rappers are the opera singers. And I had to teach these opera singers how to rap. And so it proved my point of what I was saying about the opera. So yeah, when it came to writing for this, it was kind of like I was immersing myself back into that space. But it was, much more difficult in a darker history that I was dealing with. So I did a lot of meditation, a lot of ancestor veneration and just calling upon, the spirits to kind of help, guide along this project. And so, yeah, I just kind of like let myself go, let my ego go out of it, let the rapper identity go out of it. And Carlos mentioned like in the beginning, like you're going to be the griot. Like, so that's pretty much what it was. So I took that role instead of the rapper role.
Carlos, a lot of institutions are going through this moment of racial reckoning. And at least for a place like Georgetown, this is a reckoning that was occurring prior to the summer of 2020 in George Floyd, where everybody seemed to want to jump on the racial reckoning bandwagon. But these kind of efforts, of course, don't go without, a certain amount of pushback from folks who might think that folks are pushing institutions too hard, are wondering what kind of responsibility the current institution has for practices and decisions that were made, 2 centuries ago. What has the community's response broadly in terms of Georgetown been to this project? And I wonder if there would have been might have been an aha moment for the institution where they're like, for Carlos and Marco to do this work, for Georgetown, that's one thing, but now that this thing is getting Grammy recognition, right, it actually forces the story to be more public than we might have intended in the first place.
Sure. Yeah. And that's one of the reasons why I decided to, take this project on and because we can talk about it, and do things in an institution. I think the arts has a special gift of really, breaking the ground, breaking up the fallow ground, as my father would say as a preacher. And I think the University of Georgetown in itself, I had nothing but support, from the administration, even students. You know, I'm in my classes, I would just kind of bring in little snippets of the piece. And I, just ask, well, what are you all feeling about this, racial issue that's happening in your institution? And resoundingly, they was like, we want to do better, and I included some students on the project, and so at the very beginning of the piece, you hear the names of those who were enslaved, spoken by students and staff and faculty, and then myself.
10 years old.
Susan.
10 years old.
10 years old.
Gabriel. Gabriel.
Gabriel.
8 years old.
Gabriel.
8 years old.
Peter. 5 years old.
5 years old.
Jackson. 3 years old.
3 years old.
3 years old.
It's a project that I think the university was behind, which I'm so grateful for, not only financially, but they did so much as far as, marketing the piece when it was out via YouTube and on their website. And so I had nothing but support, and I'm grateful for that.
Marco, you did the text for this project. Tell us a little bit about some of the 272 to get to be acknowledged in this particular form.
Yeah, it was heavy for me or important for me to speak the words as clearly and succinctly as possible. No, heavy metaphors, no heavy, allusions and things like that. Like, this is just straight speak.
Right. Plain speak, real talk. Yeah.
That's what it had to be. And yeah, like, my wife would tell you, like, there were literally, we have a spiritual practice in our home, but like, there were literally spirits coming to the house, like,
wow,
telling us just snippets of, I went through this, or I went through that. Like, it's like, it was heavy. And so important for me to just say plainly and say what happened, how it happened, and really speak to the energy. And I would say, 200 years is not a long time ago. And my whole point for the text was to connect, not to individualize this story. Yes, you sold 272 enslaved people, but that's connected to the larger institution of slavery that was happening all over the United States, all over the Western Hemisphere kind of deal. So my point of that text was not to just, we can't individualize this story. It's not just a Georgetown thing. This is a American chattel slavery thing that we're still, our country is still responsible for.
Carlos, talk a little bit about the genre of music that you work in. And for a little bit to share that with, with our audience, what exactly you would identify the genre that you write in.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to describe because technically it's classical, but that word classical has so much weight,
different connotations. Yep.
Yeah, and it's, we think classical, you think Beethoven, you think Mozart, and not a Black man or Black woman or any person of color. And it's a art form that was traditionally for elitists, people who had money and wealth. So, and yeah, so the thing is, it's weighted, and I'm that one of the reasons why I love classical music, though, is the music is beautiful, and I was so enamored with it as a young kid, and watching movies. And it's not, the film music they use in the same orchestra as Beethoven, and I was enamored with, what is that sound, and it led me down the path of discovering what the instruments are, okay, who wrote it? Then I discovered Beethoven and Mozart and all these things. So I'm watching Tom and Jerry, and they use traditional classical music,
right,
in the score. And then, I was like, okay, I want to write something like this. And so, but the thing is, it's still a platform for me.
Yeah.
And I've realized that there are many Black folks in the classical space, and we're doing, but there are many composers, there are many musicians who are Black or people of color who are working in the space, and so the idea that there aren't many people doing this, that's not the case. You know, there's just it's just an issue of visibility and opportunities, that sort of thing. So I'm doing my part to write the music, that, you know, and in hopes of expanding the repertoire, if you will, so that orchestras aren't just forced to play Beethoven Symphony Number 9. Nothing wrong with the symphony. I love it. It's a dear favorite of mine. But there are other works and other stories, more importantly, that can be told on those platforms.
You know, you said a couple of things that resonated with me. You know, one, you know, classical music, concert music, chamber music, you know, it is much more diverse than it's given credit for. One of my colleagues here at Duke, Anthony Kelly, is a classical composer. And it's very hard, you know, to translate that, you know, both for his colleagues who are primarily white, but also, you know, for, you know, Black folks. And so how important is it for a project like this, not only to tell the story that it does, right, to memorialize folks who deserve to be memorialized, but to also present, on the one hand, classical music as something that is accessible, particularly for younger Black folks, right? And again, you know, even going to Marco's point earlier about the opera that he did 5 years ago, libretto that he did 5 years ago, to talk about what is a very natural marriage between classical music and hip hop, right? And what that could do in terms of making both of them more available to young folks, you know, young folks reimagining what hip hop can be, and also reimagining what classical can be for them also to tell their own stories.
Yeah, well, you said it's really about the stories, and I chose to use these two platforms, these artistic genres, to tell the story. You know, this is a story. Yeah, so hip hop. You think about hip hop, there's no art form that isn't more relevant. You know, as far as speaking to today's, you know, issues. And then the classical space is I feel is a timeless art form. It's something that there's an element of you know, just being timeless. And I wanted to use that. And of course, you know, the music of our people, spirituals, you know, so that's really embedded into the work as well. And in hopes of telling this overall story. My overall vision as a composer philosophically is to, you know, make music as accessible as it can be, you know, in the classical space, especially because it's such a beautiful art form. I do feel like it can be enjoyed by everybody. You don't need a degree in order to understand this music. And that's one of the important things that I want to make with not only with this piece, but other pieces that I write.
How important is a Grammy nomination to the both of you? You know, folks get in their feelings when they get things, when they don't see deserved recognition from an entity, you know, like the entity that gives the Grammy Awards. There's always been this question about whether or not who the Grammy recognizes is as authentic as we would like it to be in terms of talking about Black culture. All those questions aside, right? How important is it to actually get a Grammy nod for the both of you? And you can start first, Marco.
I mean, it's big. It's big. Like I've been talking about, you know, winning a Grammy since I was, you know, maybe 12 or 13 years old. Obviously at 12, I wasn't thinking about being nominated in classical music. But nonetheless, it is still very important. I just came home from Memphis and the whole city is still talking about it. You turn on the radio, Mike Evans, Stan Bell, they're shouting us out. Just, you know, Marco Pave, Glorilla, like these are Grammy nominated folks from Memphis. So it's really, you know, it's battling, it's giving positive light against the juxtaposition of, you know, violence and crime and things like that are happening in the city, giving people hope, you know, I'm just a guy from North Memphis that, you know, believed in himself and followed a dream and took an unconventional path, wrote operas and done all of these things. So it's like me writing an opera makes me not look as crazy right now that I'm nominated for a Grammy in classical music. So it's like it's a huge deal. And I'm just excited and thankful that they got this one right. I will say that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when I started this project, I didn't have any expectations. You know, I told we even at the recording session that we did in May of 2021, after we finished, you know, it felt just like a spiritual experience, you know, and I was just grateful to get it out in the world, man. So I'm elated, you know, like Marco, I have, you know, actually I wrote my speech many years ago. You know what I'm saying? It's already written. The acceptance speech is already written. But I with this particular project, you know, with any project ever, I just sort of release it into the world, and it takes a life of its own.
Oh, right.
And you know, just in the short time that it's been out, it's been choreographed by, you know, by the American Ballet Theater in New York City, in Lincoln Center, right? And it's, you know, it's been used in ways that I have never imagined. And so, like, I'm just an encouragement, you know, if any composers, any artists out there, you know, if it's pieces or your art is written in love, it'll always make its way out into the world.
You know, as you delved into the archive of these 272 souls, you know, were there stories that you came across? And I know Marco talked earlier about, you know, spirits literally showing up at the house, and it's like, you need to hear this. Were there any real surprises, like things that just kind of stop you dead in your track, surprises about some of the stories that you came across?
Yeah, well, I visited the archives but also I went down to the plantations where many of those were enslaved were sold in Maryland, Louisiana, and got a chance to meet with many of the descendants there. We went to cemeteries where you would see literally on one side Black folks were buried, and then on one side it was white people buried. And many of the enslaved were on that Black side, and the graves were all obviously like sunken. You know, you can tell a difference. You know, it's like the difference is how even the upkeep of the cemetery. So just being in that space was just like absolutely spiritual. And then one thing I remember is going to the actual plantation in Maringouin, sugarcane plantation, and it was in March, so it wasn't in season, so you could see that it was sort of stripped, and it was this vast field, you know, of maybe about a mile, 2 miles of nothing but land. But in the middle of that space was a tree. And I don't know what kind of tree it was, but it was just like this in the middle of the space. And I don't know why it hit me so hard in this vast space of a sugarcane plantation, and this one tree sitting there. And that became the album artwork for the project. Yeah, but there are many stories, many things, but I didn't want to get too heavy into it because you can get lost easy. You know, what is the emotion? What is it trying to tell me?
Right.
What and Marco, that was his job, to be the storyteller.
Yeah, I would say one that stood out that you sent to me, Carlos, was kind of the shoes for Harriet. There was an enslaved woman named Harriet, and the story kind of goes like in the archive. It's basically like, you know, she was caught selling shoes down the road or stealing shoes down the road, and I think she was kind of punished for that. And kind of like the true dramatized story of her life kind of came to me, because it's like on paper they just say it as if it's just so robotic and you know, whatever. So Harriet had a life. Harriet had family members. Harriet had, you know, all of these things. And so, you know, from just what they sparsely said on the paper, I could infer that she was maybe a fair-skinned woman. I can infer that she was, you know, more closer to the more powerful people, and she had family members that were down the road, and she was sending these shoes to her family members down the road as a gift, as a token of appreciation, of just like, I'm using whatever resource I can get. I'm an enslaved woman, but I'm still going to try to do what I can do to help. And she got caught and punished for that. So yeah, that's kind of like one of the stories that really stood out for me, is like Black people in this institution trying to figure out how they can still help people who have less power in the same institution that they're in, kind of deal. So yeah.
Are y'all imagining doing more collaborations down the road?
I would say absolutely. Carlos is super booked and busy, so he, but yeah, I think it's a lot can come from that.
Yeah, I also think we have a lot of dates perform the piece, because this piece was written over the pandemic and we were trying to get it performed, that things are sort of backed up. So we did our first performance of the piece when was that, over the summer?
October.
October?
Yeah, October
October 2022. That was the first performance of the piece. So we kind of backed up with performances now. And so we are planning to do some things around that. So that's the first order of business.
Yeah.
We've been joined today by Carlos Simon and Marco Pave, who collaborated on an amazing project, Requiem for the Enslaved, which acknowledges the Georgetown University 272, the at least 272 folks who were held in enslavement by the institution in an earlier period of time. I want to thank both of you for obviously joining me on Left to Black, but also thank you for doing and collaborating on this extraordinary project.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black, everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back, black.